I must have heard it from my friends 100 times now. You really seem to like that Witcher book series, huh? Alright, Niwa, you got me. I want to read the Witcher books, but where do I start? Well, as you just said, I got you. Whether you're interested in reading the Witcher books because you've seen the show and are now looking for the original story, the Witcher 4 trailer was just released and got you hyped, or you're just looking to catch up on some 90s fantasy that you never got around to reading, this video will cover the reading order of the Witcher books, including the new release published just last month, Crossroads of Ravens. By the way, I have a review of that coming out soon on the channel, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it. First, I'll give a little bit of context as to how publication affected The Witcher's order, why the reading order of The Witcher is confusing for a lot of English readers, and the differences in the expectations that you should have for The Witcher stories versus The Witcher Saga. At the end of the video, I'll also be cluing you in on some extra stories and author materials that have never actually been officially published in English, for which reason other reading orders typically miss. So, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Niwa and welcome to Ani Vitre, a channel dedicated to the Witcher book series. Now, what is The Witcher anyways? Much like when asking about the reading order, that is a seemingly very straightforward question, but unfortunately has become a little bit more confusing than it should be. Don't worry, because it's actually pretty easy. But to understand the reading order, we first got to understand how The Witcher was first published, because that publication affects not only the order you may prefer to read in, but exactly what you will be reading. I promise that I will keep the history to a minimum because we can save that for other videos on the channel, but let's just get started. The Witcher is a Polish series of fantasy short stories and novels primarily published in the 1990s by author Andrzej Sapkowski. Sapkowski, who originally studied foreign trade, was a writer only as a hobbyist until the publication of the first book in the Witcher saga in 1994. So we should start there, right? No, because The Witcher started as a series of loosely related short stories published in the magazine Fantastica, later renamed Nowa Fantastica. The first Witcher short story, simply titled Wiedźmin, or The Witcher, was the third place winner of a short story contest held by the magazine. After its unexpected success, Sapkowski received demand from readers to write more stories for the magazine, and write more he did. These first few short stories, which were created when Sapkowski had no vision yet of what The Witcher would later become, were published from 1986 to 1991. During this period, he was also working on another fantasy novel, which he then scrapped and turned into a short story instead. We'll get back to that at the end. What is important for you as the reader in 2025, or beyond, to understand is that these first few Witcher short stories were later taken by Sapkowski, fixed up, added to, reframed, and bound into anthologies, the first two books in the Witcher series, which the reading order begins with: The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny. Somewhat confusingly, the second book of the cycle, Sword of Destiny, was published in 1992, while The Last Wish, the first book, was published in 1993. This is because there were difficulties associated with trying to get published as a novel writer at this time. Especially after Poland transitioned to a capitalist system after 1989, it became even more challenging, due to the massive influx of American fiction which now flooded the shelves. But publisher Supernova took a risk by publishing a run of 4 Polish authors at once, one of them being Sapkowski. So, these various historical and economic factors were why short stories, not novels, were the debut and original creation of The Witcher, which one should start with. As for what to expect about the short stories, these stories center around the protagonist Geralt of Rivia as we are introduced to the atmosphere, world, and main characters of The Witcher. As opposed to the saga, which we will get to in a second, these first few short stories are much more limited in scope and insular than you might expect a fantasy series to be. Sapkowski never drew up a map, for example, which is an expectation for an author of a fantasy series to do. The world building was initially developed in bits and pieces, and in the earliest stories, there were no bigger world or timelines to contend with, just these incidentally related episodes connecting the characters. And specifically, these first short stories Sapkowski wrote directly parody various European fairy tales. Though the saga also consists of playing with and deconstructing various fantasy tropes and cliches, you will find that the way A Grain of Truth is structured, for example, to be very different than Lady of the Lake. I say this because a misguided expectation people tend to have about The Witcher is that the first book in the series will represent the last, which is not the case here. But as they became anthologies, the magic in these stories come from how Sapkowski bound them together. The stories within The Last Wish are not chronologically told, but not to worry, because they are bound within a frame story, Voice of Reason, which positions each story so you get a general sense of when they occur. And in the second volume, Sword of Destiny, there is no frame story and these stories are chronologically told. That is until you get to the last story in the anthology, Something More, in which the events are not structured chronologically, but they all make sense at the end, so don't worry about it and keep reading when you get to that one. As we begin to transition from short stories to the saga, it is worth giving a side note here for specifically English readers such as myself. Do not read the books in the order of publication in English, because that order will only serve to confuse you. The Witcher series was translated into English out of order for various reasons. Initially, the publisher thought that people might respond better to an anthology and a novel rather than two anthologies, so the first two books in English were already out of order right out of the gate. This is why some people believe Blood of Elves to be the first book in the series when it is not. Then there were legal issues which caused a big delay, and the publisher actually switched translators mid-series from Danusia Stock to David French. This all means that Sword of Destiny, the second book in the series, didn't end up getting translated until 8 years after the first book, The Last Wish, which led to a lot of confusion for the English audience on which book goes where. This is also why people unfortunately end up skipping the short stories because, oh, they're just short stories, not understanding that that's the actual beginning of The Witcher. And then they have no idea what's going on when they just jumped right into the saga with no context, so pay that method no mind. Now let's begin with the saga, and if you've read Sword of Destiny, technically you kind of already have. Because Sapkowski initially intended for the last two short stories in the Sword of Destiny anthology, Sword of Destiny and Something More, to be the beginning of the Witcher saga, or as he refers to it, the Witcher Pentateuch. Calling it the saga was the publisher's idea. And as you may be able to tell after reading these two stories, the Witcher saga shifts the subject focus from the initial stories and positions it around the Witcher Geralt's daughter, Ciri, as well as giving opportunity for the world and its politics to take shape, putting everything in a more expected form of a fantasy novel series. Sapkowski's whole idea about writing The Witcher was, because there were no Polish fantasy sagas at the time, he believed that the Polish fantasy should have at least one saga. Now, this shift in focus doesn't mean that Geralt disappears from the story. Far from it. But unlike in the short stories, the saga is told from multiple points of view, including those of side characters and minor background characters, and Ciri and Geralt begin to function as dual protagonists. I mention this because it also comes unexpected to some readers who read the first two anthology books, liked them a lot, but then get disappointed when they approach the saga because they expected the whole series to be about Geralt encountering and dealing with monsters. And that's not really what it's about. The Witcher saga really follows Geralt in his role as Ciri's father and protector, Ciri's independent coming-of-age story, the development of many different side characters, and the fierce political landscape of the world. These 5 novels, published from 1994 to 1999, are Blood of Elves, Time of Contempt, Baptism of Fire, Tower of the Swallow, and Lady of the Lake. You may have also seen the Tower of the Swallow listed incorrectly as the Tower of the Swallows, plural, but this is an unfortunate mistranslation of the Polish title Wieże Jaskółki, as the title in context refers to the one singular swallow. This 5-book saga, added to the 2 Witcher anthologies, are altogether what is considered the core Witcher cycle, a series of 7 books that are a complete and comprehensive series, which concluded in the 90s. But Sapkowski also returned to The Witcher after a little over a decade and adds to the series with new novels as he pleases. Now, let's figure out where to place The Witcher's more recent novels, the midquel, Season of Storms, published 2013, and the prequel, Crossroads of Ravens, published 2024. At the end, just read them after the saga. Alright, now seriously, these 2 novels are additional adventures if you are hungering for more Witcher, and they also develop the canon and world building out a bit more. However, to be clear, they are not necessary to understand the core cycle, which, for all intents and purposes, again, concluded in 1999. Season of Storms, chronologically, takes place right before the short story The Witcher, which makes its events happen sometime between the stories within The Last Wish. Because of this, some reading orders place it in between The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, but this is unadvised, because Season of Storms contains not only references and allusions to the saga, but direct spoilers for its ending. So if you do not want unexpected spoilers, do not read this book until after reading the last book of the saga, Lady of the Lake. And Crossroads of Ravens is similar. It is a prequel about Geralt as a young man, just starting out as a Witcher. Chronologically, it takes place before any of the other books. However, despite that chronological placement, during my read of it, I found the amount of callbacks and allusions to the saga to be noticeable. So noticeable that I would say the book is best enjoyed after having read the saga, so you can catch all of the references, and also because its plot really parallels the main storyline of the saga. Unlike Season of Storms, I wouldn't say that there's exactly a ton of spoilers for the main saga in it. However, the main plot of Crossroads of Ravens centers around an event which is first introduced in the first book of the saga, Blood of Elves. So, I think that reading Crossroads of Ravens before at least Blood of Elves would be confusing to say the least. There is a lot that this novel assumes about the reader's knowledge of Witchers and the world, so it might be a bit confusing and going too fast for someone new to the series. Thus, like Season of Storms, it's best to save Crossroads of Ravens for after the saga. However, if prequels are your thing and you really want to read a prequel before you read the rest of the series, go ahead, it's your choice. Also, Crossroads of Ravens isn't even out in English yet, although publication is slated for this year. Yay! Or if you're impatient like me and want to read it now, you can also buy it in Polish and use online translation tools. But I won't blame you if you want to wait for the official. Grasshoppers. Finally, let's get to these extras which I promised you at the beginning of the video. These 2 stories and 1 reference material have never been officially translated and published in English, which is why a lot of English reading guides leave them off. That being said, they are available through fan translations, and a couple have even been community projects for a long time. So they are out there for the English readers that are interested. The first is the short story Road of No Return, which is about Geralt's biological mother and alleged father. This is a story which I mentioned in the beginning of the video, which was originally the makings of a novel that Sapkowski then edited down to just a story. Initially, it wasn't connected to the Witcher cycle at all, but in the short story Something More, Sapkowski decided to connect the 2 canons and make them one. And because of that, you can read Road of No Return as soon as you finish Sword of Destiny. I would even recommend you to read it then, for maximum emotional investment in the characters. Next, we have the non-canon short story Something Ends, Something Begins, which was written as a wedding present and shared joke for 2 prominent translators in the Polish speculative fiction community at the time. Although this story was published in the fanzine Red Dwarf in 1993, right before the first book of the saga, I would actually recommend to read this story after reading the saga, for a predictable reason. Spoilers. Although it's not canon and basically a fan fiction, but from the author fiction, there are some massive spoilers for who these characters become and what they end up doing by the end of the saga. It seems that Sapkowski really did have the saga planned out and included a lot of those elements in this story. Plus, the lighthearted and affectionate, funny mood of the story will be of great value to you, let's say, as a reader, after you finish Lady of the Lake. Finally, one last material that's often missed in reading guides for The Witcher, Sapkowski's genealogy, which you can also find by its alternate fan title, Dynastic Descriptions. This is not a story nor a novel, but rather a set of referenced genealogies for the royal lineages of the northern kingdoms, some cleaned up and published author's notes, which were then virtually published on Sapkowski's old fan site, the Andrzej Sapkowski Zone. This genealogy is a background guide to some of the key political players featured in the novels, as well as introducing some ancestral characters not featuring in them. It adds a lot of unique, interesting context for these otherwise somewhat side characters. You get backstories in the author's commentary on them, and especially if fantasy, politics, and following family trees and dynasties are your thing, you shouldn't miss out on this one. Who's to say that Sapkowski never did world building? He's just not geographically inclined. And I had to include a brief note on translations in this video. The Witcher being a Polish series, all English texts that you read will be translations. If you've never read translated text before, you might be confused if, say, for instance, you go on Goodreads and encounter the same quote from the same passage from the same book, but phrased differently using different words. This is because translation is not an exact science. There is a lot of nuance involved, and different translators might choose to translate the same text differently. For The Witcher, there is only one officially published translation, as mentioned, and its quality has mixed reviews. This is an ongoing debate in the fandom. My personal opinion about the official translation of The Witcher is that it's not difficult to read, as in it's not clunky, but that ease of reading actually becomes a downside at some points, because us English readers miss out on specific grammar and wordplay that is a hallmark of Sapkowski's writing, as well as cultural references which were unfortunately omitted without a trace as to not confuse and interrupt the English reader. That is all to say, you can also encounter fan translations of The Witcher online, And I would actually recommend, if you're interested, reading the official translation side by side with fan translations, which often provide more insight and nuance to the contents of the original text. Especially if you have an interest in translation, languages, or are simply rereading the series, it can add a new dimension to The Witcher for you. I would also like to recommend a couple of different fan-created resources which begin to untangle some of the elements lost in the Polish-English translation, which I am ever grateful for and will link to down in the description. My final recommendation for dealing with the translations is to, if you're comfortable, engage the Witcher community online, make friends, and ask questions. You can learn a lot just from talking to people and discussing what you're reading. And if audiobooks are your thing, there are some amazing audiobooks for The Witcher out there. The English versions are read by Peter Kenny, who is greatly entertaining because he does all the different voices for the characters, so it's pretty fun to listen to.
My deepest respect, venerable mother, he whined stupidly.
And if you're interested in immersive listening experiences, there are also the Polish audio dramas produced by Phonopolis, which go up to Baptism of Fire. These are in the style of radio plays, which, by the way, Poland has a rich history of. These involve actual actor performances, music, and sound effects, which makes it that much more immersive.
Za mną kto w bogów wierzy! Napij dugę! Pij! Zabij!
I want to say that although they're in Polish, you can also listen to them without knowing any Polish. Just put it on and read along with the English text. It's like watching a movie with subtitles. Just with no watching and only listening, but the performances are so good, you'll forget you're not watching a movie. To summarize the reading order of The Witcher, begin with the anthologies The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny. After finishing these two anthologies, you can optionally read the short story Road of No Return. After finishing the short stories, to begin the Witcher saga, you should read the 5 books in order, beginning with Blood of Elves, then Time of Contempt, Baptism of Fire, Tower of the Swallow, and Lady of the Lake. As you are reading the saga, you may want to also read the genealogy for reference and entertainment. You can do this at your leisure, but if you're looking for a specific time in between books to read it, I would personally recommend reading it in between Time of Contempt and Baptism of Fire, because the first 4 books will naturally bring you up to speed on the different political players and dynasties involved, but it begins to get a little complicated in Baptism of Fire, because this book, famously, has a chapter which really goes into a main character's genealogy. It can be confusing even if you were paying good attention to the previous books. After finishing the saga with Lady of the Lake, you can read the optional non-canon short story Something Ends, Something Begins, the midquel novel Season of Storms, and the prequel novel Crossroads of Ravens. And if you are rereading the series, you can also consider some alternative reading orders like reading all the short stories and books in the order of publication to get a blast of nostalgia for the 80s and 90s. Or you can even structure all the stories and books chronologically if that's your thing. That being said, both of these alternative reading orders would probably be confusing on your first read, but I just wanted to throw something out there for the seasoned fans as well as for the newbies. Finally, as we close out, a note that I want to leave you with. Following the recommended reading order and avoiding spoilers is recommended for a reason, and it can really make your experience as a reader more immersive. But it's also not absolutely necessary to enjoy the story at the end of the day. If you've messed up and read Blood of Elves first because you bought it first, or you got spoiled because you were introduced to The Witcher through the games or the Netflix show, it's not the end of the world. I was personally introduced to The Witcher through The Witcher 3, which meant that I got a bunch of spoilers, and then I read the Witcher books really out of order, but I'm like a super fan now, so in the long run, it might not affect your enjoyment all that much. However, I know that reading order matters to a lot of readers, especially fantasy readers, and because of the kind of chaotic publication of The Witcher, both originally in Polish and then later as it was translated into English, even though it is simple, it may not seem like it when you're just looking it up for the first time and getting all of these different, conflicting, and even spoiler-ridden results. So I hope that this video helped you out, and leave a comment to let me know. If you plan to read or reread The Witcher books in 2025, what brought you here? I'd love to hear everyone's different reasons for being brought together. Or if you just want to leave a comment to remind yourself to read them later, you can also do that. And if you're trying to get your friend or your family member to finally read The Witcher, feel free to send them this video. Also, if you're thinking about reading The Witcher books or are interested in The Witcher, subscribe, because this is my channel for talking about The Witcher books. Although a lot of my videos include spoilers, I do put warnings for spoilers in the videos before they are discussed, as well as in the descriptions. And I never put direct spoilers in video titles, so you won't get spoiled just by looking at your subscriptions box. If you look at my channel, my current videos focus more on the real-life circumstances surrounding the writing and the publication of The Witcher, and I'll continue with that, but I will also soon be posting analysis of the books themselves, starting with my review of the new prequel, Crossroads of Ravens, which I will hopefully finish editing ASAP. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again sometime soon on Ani Vitre.